In this video, I'm just going to be showing the principles of KitBashing, and then we're going to look at some of the more advanced things you can do. It's important to stress that KitBashing is not how final assets are produced for games. Normally, KitBashing is used as an experimental approach, or it's used for concept work. KitBashing can also be used for sprites and for baking down. It's a good way of generating hard surface, high poly models that might be retopologized. In this case, we're using KitBashing as a way of being creative, but also to explore the 3D space and to learn the appropriate tools. So there are three main transforms for manipulating objects. We have the move transform, the rotate transform, and the scale transform. And there's two variations of scale. One is uniform scale, where the object just gets bigger, and there is a non-uniform scale where the object becomes stretched. We can also right click on an object and it brings up a context sensitive menu. That is that this menu depends on what you're doing or what you have selected. As I have an object selected, you can see that this context menu has move, rotate and scale options right here. So if you want to switch reasonably quickly between them, you can use this. The keyboard shortcuts for this are W. The keyboard shortcuts for this are W, E, and R. And if you're using Unreal a lot, you'll tend to hit the space bar to change modes. And what this does is it locks the selection. So you need to be fairly wary about hitting the space bar, because this means you won't be able to select anything else and it will stay in this particular mode. So if I want to select this, if I hit spacebar, it's going to not let me select anything else. It will just insist on keeping that object selected. Okay, so when KitBashing, I tend to try and keep at least one object on the origin and also have some reference about what it is that I'm trying to do. Some of the principal things that you want to do is you just move things around and get them roughly in the right place. If you want to align objects together, then you can use the Align tool. So if I click on the Align tool and I click on another object, it will come up with this window where we can select which axes we want to align and whether we're wanting to center objects or align their pivots. And you can do the same with the orientation. So now, as it happens, moving, rotating objects is quite straightforward, but scale and non-uniform scale can be particularly difficult. So let's just have a look at what happens when we, I'll just quickly move this up and then we can look at what happens when I scale the object uniform. So the whole object gets bigger and smaller, as you would expect. If I scale along the z-axis, it stretches because it is only scaling in the y-axis, and this is useful. The one thing that you do have to watch though is the axes of the scale, because if I go and rotate this object so that it is off to one side and then I go back to scale and now I scale it along the z-axis, you can see that now this object is distorting. So even though I'm scaling along the z-axis, it isn't getting longer along that original z-axis, and this is because of the type of axis I'm using. At the moment this is in view mode. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo this and get it back. So what you have to be careful of is if you've got an object rotated and you want to scale along one of its original axes, then you should switch from view mode to the local mode, and you can see that now the z-axis is aligned to the rotation of the object, and now I can scale it along its original axes. The other thing that you will want to do quite often is you want to duplicate an object. So if I switch over to mood mode and I shift and drag this object, we will get a message come up. So there's some options here on how you copy the object. We're not going to worry about that for the moment, but there's also how many copies you want. So if I set this to 4 and I press OK, what we'll get is we'll get another 4 copies of the object, equally spaced from the distance that I first moved. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a bit of kit bashing, just to demonstrate the use of the tools. So the first thing I want to do is I just want to get a sense of the space and the volume. So I'm going to block out some very large forms, and this will help me construct around these base forms. So the tool I'm going to use here is I'm going to use a modifier, and this modifier is the bend modifier, and it will allow me to literally bend the geometry so that I can get it into the shape and mold it into the previous meshes. And as you can see, I did a duplicate there, but I did it whilst rotating rather than just moving. And I also duplicated far too many objects than I needed, so that I could just delete the ones that I didn't think were in the right place. And now you can see that I'm using the symmetry tool to make sure that I get the left and right of the skull to be symmetrical. One of the things here is that these two pieces of geometry connected. Normally I would just split them, but just for the purposes of this exercise, you can see that I don't care the fact that one of those pieces of geometry is just inside the model. It's never going to get seen. It would be really bad practice if I was doing this for a game ready piece of artwork, but in this instance it doesn't matter. It's just about creating a form. So in this next step, I'm going to use quite an interesting way of generating lots of repetitive geometry. So once I've got these top pieces roughly where I want them, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to animate where I want the pieces to be. So you can see I'm actually going to create a key about halfway down the skull in one position, and then I'm going to create another key further down the skull, which will be at the end of the animation. And then what I'm going to use is I'm going to use the snapshot tool, and what this will allow me to do is to effectively capture every single frame as a piece of geometry, and I can specify the number of geometry, and now I have this kind of spine control mechanism at the back of the head. So take note of how this jaw geometry actually bends and deforms because of the scale. So even though I'm bending the object and it should curve perfectly well, but because there's a non-uniform scale on the object, we can see some distortion in the actual bend. The next tool I'm using here is the Select and Place tool. And what this tool does is it allows you to drag objects, and when Max detects that they're over the top of another object, what they'll do is they'll try and orientate them so that they're aligned correctly. It is a rather finicky tool because it relies on you setting up your objects correctly, and as you can see from this clip, the axes were slightly off and it didn't work, but I just rotated them and fixed it. At this point, all the different colors are kind of getting distracting, so I've switched it over to the clay mode, and this basically sets all of the materials to be the same darkish red material, and that kind of helps your eyes rest because sometimes it can be very distracting with too much color on screen. So the last tool I use is a refinement of the align tool. There's a drop down menu, and what this tool will let you do is it will align two surfaces. So you can select the face you want to align, and then you select the face you want it to align to, and it will basically snap those two surfaces and orientate them together. So now that I have this robot head complete, what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach it all together so that it's a single object. So I'm going to select this main piece, which is still an editable mesh. I'm going to convert it to an editable poly. Don't need these pieces. For some reason I've switched my mech. So let's just hide that. So I'm going to attach and you can just click to attach things, or you can attach with a list, which will bring up a list of the components. So I can select all of this and hit attach, and now you can see I just have the one component. The symmetry's been preserved, even though the model that I used wasn't the one with the symmetry modifier on it. Now the other thing I need to do is I need to check my smoothing groups, or in this case I'm just going to simply put a smoothing group modifier on them, and this will help you understand what a modifier actually does. So I'm going to go to my mesh editing, and I'm going to go to smooth, and in this case we can set up automatic smoothing groups. So if I turn the threshold down, you can see we have a lot of hard edges, and if I turn the smoothing groups up, you can see that we can get rid of most of the hard edges. Now it will only smooth between connected edges, so it won't smooth if the surfaces are completely different. I'm going to set it back down to about 45 because that's about the angle that I want. Now, smoothing group modifier is a brute force method. Again, when it comes to game ready models, we will actually go in and specify the surfaces. So that wraps up the introduction to kit bashing.